Hello Year 11, this is Mrs Mainwaring and I'm going to talk to you about A Wife in London by Thomas Hardy. So firstly, as you know, it is really important to know relevant context about the poet and the poem itself. So A Wife in London was written in 1899 by Thomas Hardy during the Boer War in South Africa. There were two Boer Wars and he wrote during the Second Boer War, which was between British and the settlers of Dutch origin in the area of Boer in South Africa. In terms of battle, this was very much an unmatched and unfair battle, with over 400,000 British troops fighting against a mere 52,000 Boer men. 22,000 Boer men and 25,000 British men actually lost their lives ultimately, and many of the Boer troops were actually untrained, and some were said to be as young as 9 years old fighting in the battle. Most of these young men were from farming backgrounds and were completely inexperienced and absolutely not suitable to be fighting in war. Now, Hardy was actually completely anti-war and he was very much against this war, and his poetry often conveyed war as futile and destructive, and specifically this poem, A Wife in London, is conveying that perspective. Also at the time, London was enveloped in thick fog throughout the 1880s, for days at a time, making visibility impossible. Now I'm going to read the poem to you before we look at it in a bit more detail. Please note that the version I have here on the presentation has slightly different wording in line 3, the Thames side lanes, whereas in your anthology it says the city lanes, so apologies for that. I'll be reading the anthology version. A Wife in London, Part 1, The Tragedy. She sits in the tawny vapour that the city lanes have uprolled, behind whose webby fold on fold, like a waning taper, the street lamp glimmers cold. A messenger's knock cracks smartly, flashed news is in her hand, of meaning it dazes to understand, though shaped so shortly. He has fallen in the far south land. 2. The Irony. 'Tis the morrow, the fog hangs thicker. The postman nears and goes. A letter is brought whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker his hand, whom the worm now knows. Fresh, firm, penned in the highest feather, page full of his hoped return, and of home-planned jaunts by brake and burn, in the summer weather, and of new love that they would learn. What is the poem about? Well, it starts under the heading The Tragedy, describing a woman receiving the tragic news of her husband's death in the Boer War. And the irony is presented the following day when she receives a letter from the husband himself, talking optimistically about his return home and their future plans. Hardy seems to be reminding us of the awful ironies in life as well as the futility of war. Key themes are death and loss, effects of war, love and relationships, and hope. Looking at form and structure for AO2, this is told from the perspective of an observer who gives a third-person limited narrative perspective, focusing specifically on the wife, whilst also remaining completely detached from the situation. It's organised into quintets, so 5-line stanzas, using the asymmetrical A-B-B-A-B rhyme scheme, which could represent the kind of continuous routine of waiting for the news of her husband, and those the continual fog and tawny vapour that's referred to in the poem as well. The most obvious thing structurally is that it is organised into 2 parts. You've got the irony and the tragedy first, and then the irony, and both parts are equal in length, just to emphasise the significance of both phases of the wife's life. and them both being equally important. Caesura is also used both in part 1 and in part 2 to slow down the pace, giving a sense of shock and reflective tone as well. Let's look at some key quotations now, focusing on language and some of the devices used, starting with the title itself and the use of the indefinite article a, showing really that this wife isn't one specific wife who's being focused on. She represents other wives in this situation, other wives who are at home waiting for news, waiting for their husbands to return from their heroic battles elsewhere. And the fact that it's set in London, we must remember that Hardy himself was born in Dorset. The fact that it's set in London could really exemplify the fact that 19th century London was not only the capital of England, but it was also the capital of the British Empire. The vast collection of countries around the world that had been colonised by Britain, and the largest city in the world at that point. But it had a host of problems as well. And of course, you know, Victorians were experiencing this poverty, this dirtiness from pollution and industrialization in their own capital city, this world famous capital city. So Hardy could also be, you know, when he's describing the fog and all the other kind of conditions, he could also be illustrating what was happening in this amazing capital city at the same time. Just to examine some of the key language, the poem actually begins with the title, The Tragedy, which gives us an immediate sense of apprehension and anticipation as the reader starts to anticipate what the tragedy is. Hardy is immediately setting a sinister and foreboding tone, and he's also setting his disapproval and conveying his disapproval quite clearly of the conflict. He is showing his viewpoint that war is tragic and lives are lost. He moves on to start with the line, she sits in the tawny vapour, and that tawny vapour creates this image of the yellow-brown London smog that is almost enveloping, smothering, shall we say, the wife who is waiting for news day after day. It creates straight away this ominous, eerie kind of mood. That image of the fog is continued in the next line as the city lanes have uprolled, and that verb uprolled again gives a sense that the fog is covering everything and it's almost rolling over the city. And then the image of the webby fold on fold has connotations of entrapment, as it refers, it is reminiscent of a spider's web, giving a sense again that the wife is trapped and that her fate, you know, the fate of her husband is inescapable and inevitable, and she can't avoid it. Moving on, the simile like a waning taper gives the image of hope and light, as you know, the description of the taper is referring to a candle, and the fact that it's waning, the fire is almost going out, which represents, you know, her hope fading, just as she's about to receive the news of his death. And the street lamp glimmering cold, or glimmers cold, is an oxymoron because you've got the light that glimmers, which would project and suggest warmth and hope, whereas it's countered by the contrast of the cold. And in the second stanza, there's quite a shift as the messenger's knock cracks smartly, and the onomatopoeic sound emphasizes the sound of the knock on the door from the messenger, and it really shows it has quite a violent, harsh effect, which contrasts with the empty, silent scene in stanza 1. So the news, the next line moves on to flashed news in her hand, referring to the telegram being delivered. And it's a noun phrase that shows really that she's received this news, and again it's very sudden, and it's quite an insensitive way to receive the news, just rather suddenly and abruptly. And then, of course, you've got the fact that he's fallen, the use of the euphemism there to tell her that he has died. In the second part, the irony, the fog hangs thicker, and that could represent, you've got the pathetic fallacy again, and this time, it refers to the literal fog as well as the fog of the grief suffered by the wife. So this fog is now representing, the deep depression and deep grief that the wife is now experiencing now that she's a widow. The word thicker suggests the claustrophobia depicted in the first stanza, which is now worse and much more extreme. And it implies that her grief upon receiving her husband's letter is even more profound than receiving the news of his death. So as the postman now delivers the new correspondence, this time a letter from her husband, her late husband, we have another key quotation. So a letter is brought whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker. And just the use of the alliteration, the alliterative firelight flicker, it kind of gives a gentle, welcoming sound, which is hugely ironic given the circumstances in this case, followed by the news that she's just received. It reinforces the melancholy sadness as the woman sits alone and upset and aware of her husband's death in this firelight. And it also goes back to images of light, which kind of goes back to the images that we had in the first and second stanza of the waning taper and the street lamp also glimmering as well. And then we have a rather graphic image of his hand whom the worm now knows, a graphic reference to the fact that he has died and that his body will be decaying. So it's a shocking and very vivid image of death and physical decay. The final stanza begins with the alliterative fresh, firm, penned in highest feather, with caesura as well to create poignant pauses, really to emphasize the sadness and the irony that the husband was actually, really excited about writing this rather jovial letter, which had lots of plans for his hoped return. And the line penned in highest feather is referring to, it actually means written in high spirits, and it just makes it all the more sad and melancholy that the husband isn't coming back and the wife is not going to experience these things that he's promised in the letter. And And the stanza goes on to describe the things that he had written about, and of home plan jaunts, of break and burn. So references to nature, of streams and woods that they would have enjoyed together, that of course they will not be able to enjoy now. And then just to finish off, it says, in the summer weather, and of new love that they would learn. And then it ends with the end stop, the full stop, to obviously signify the finality of their relationship and the fact that this will not happen, as she is now a widow. Lastly, in terms of comparable poems to A Wife in London, The Manhunt is one that compares quite well with this. And that's because, of course, it also presents a wife's perspective of loss as a result of her husband returning from war. It's not a physical loss, but it is very much an emotional loss there, as he comes back and suffers from PTSD. Another one that would work in comparison to A Wife in London is Dulce Decorum Est, which I've just realised is spelt incorrectly, so I'm sorry about that. Please do check the spelling, because it describes that works well, because it also conveys the poet's view that war is completely futile and destructive and causes unnecessary loss. So thank you for listening, Year 11, and good luck with your exams.